Fine art photographer Ellie Davies has become known for her cinematic forestscapes that explore the complex relationship between landscape and the individual. Like much of her work, her most recent series, Seascapes, centres on the climate crisis, but it's also a meditation on her own nostalgic feelings about a more innocent time in her life when she experienced the woodland landscape as a child. I caught up with Ellie on a Zoom call to discuss new work on the eve of its launch. Hi, Ellie.
Hello, good to see you.
Hey, you too. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Well, thanks. So we're here today to talk about your new series, Seascapes.
Yeah.
The series was born out of your concern about the climate crisis, and in particular, the awful flooding that's been happening each year in the New Forest where you grew up. When did you start the series, and could you tell us a bit about the evolution of the work?
So I started the series back in early 2019, but I'd been thinking about the issues involved for a lot longer. I work in the landscape, and the climate crisis is at the forefront of all our minds, I think. And I'd always wanted to find a way to express some of these thoughts and concerns. I'd been thinking about lots of different approaches, and I'd had a bit of a gap in my creative output from the end of the Half Light series to starting to make this. And it's not that I wasn't making photography, it was more that I was just not focusing on one particular project. So sometimes it's nice to just expand things. With this series, I wanted to free myself from a lot of the kind of strictures that I tend to impose. When I started making this series, I decided that I wanted to make sure that I use all sorts of different landscape settings, different approaches to my technical way of working, and to try and kind of open it up for myself and free myself, because I'm the only one that imposes those parameters on the work. It's been a really freeing process, this series.
You've talked before about a series of work finding its own agenda when you're in the process of creating it. How did that come into play in this work?
So I think it happens when I just start to get out in the woods and start to make the work, because I can have an idea, but it's often quite loose. And particularly with this series, I wanted to keep it loose, keep it open. It's a lovely process of just going into the woods, finding places I want to work, finding how the theme somehow fits within that. And it takes on a life of its own. It's that's the best part of the creative process for me, is that unexpected element of, the kind of evolution of an idea into something that takes on its own life, really. And I've always found that in anything I've done creatively, whether it's sculpture or making jewelry or something. You start with an idea and suddenly you're kind of going down this wonderful, slightly introverted tunnel of concentration and creativity. And that's, for me, that's the real pleasure in making my work. Seeing what happens, it's always surprising.
We'll talk in a minute about the poem that inspired you, was an influence on you, Nostalgia by Don Patterson. But where did the feelings of nostalgia come in naturally for you while you were in the woods? I mean, was it just a feeling that comes over you when you're in that environment anyway?
I think it was later, actually. I think that poem didn't really necessarily inspire the series. I think I've used it in my statement later to try and elaborate on how I was feeling and some of the themes that were coming through whilst making that work. So it wasn't so much that it was a poem that I'd found at the beginning and drawn on. Mm-hmm. It's called Nostalgia, but for me it's a kind of poignancy. So it's that kind of bittersweet, I suppose you could call it nostalgia, but it's less sad for me. It's about that absolutely quintessential sensation of memory that happens when you think back to a time that you can't necessarily recapture, but it has this very evocative ability to just transport you back to a past time. And I think because I've experienced so much of learning about the woods and being in the woods with my twin sister, I mentioned her in my statement for this series, it becomes kind of intrinsic to the work, that experience of, relating that to her.
Does she come with you when you're working?
Very rarely. She lives in Devon now. Well, it has done for a long time. And before that, she lived in the States for 5 years. So I tend to work alone now. I used to go with my mum a lot, but she and I love to chat and I'd find it really distracting. So I tend to go alone because I am also always trying to capture that wonderful feeling of when you are alone in the woods, because it's very different from when you're with somebody else.
We've talked before about your work being a celebration of the process and how you like to immerse yourself in the surroundings when you're working. Could you describe that process in the making of these works?
My work's always about trying to capture the experience of being in the woods. I think that's fundamentally where it comes back to, whether or not I'm trying to also explore other themes. The kind of most central element is always about how it feels to be in the woods. And I think that's why my work is often interpreted differently by different people, because people have varying responses to woodland and forests. It kind of ranges from absolutely blissful to pure terror. So it's always really interesting. And I've had very varied experiences making my work in the woods too. And I'm often in the woods at dusk or sometimes at night. And I think the idea of that is very different from the reality of it. I often find it a really beautiful, peaceful, meditative experience.
And so do you always feel safe and secure even if it's dusk? And
well, if I'm working at night, I always go into the woods while it's light, because it makes a huge difference when it gets dark and you already have kind of occupied the space, got a sense of where you are and a place within the woods. It sounds strange, but you kind of going into a dark place is much more intimidating than being there as it gets dark. I have had scary experiences, but I just leave immediately if I get weird vibes.
Where did you take the photographs and over what time period?
So I started making a series in early 2019 and finished it in about February 2020. So it's been a year. I made a lot of images that haven't been included, but that's usually the case. Some more than others, but this series particularly, I shot a lot that, just because of this wanting to open it up and make it freer, I think meant that maybe it's narrowed again in the editing process a bit, but you have to do that. I have to be strict with myself and be sure that it works. So most of it was made in the New Forest. Some was made in Puddleton Forest in Dorset, because I live about 20 minutes down the road now. And some in woodland on Dartmoor. So quite a mixture, but mostly southern England.
Are there works that you're particularly pleased with the outcome of?
Yeah, I mean, there's one that I really love. In fact, there are several actually, and I find it's usually to do with the kind of the day out. Each image tends to be the consequence of a day's work. So it will be about the process of making it, not just the visual kind of product of what's happened. So there's one image that's very blue, and I made that just after Christmas. I went out, and it was during the time there'd been really significant flooding in the New Forest. I found this really amazing flooded oak woodland, and I mean, it's somewhere that I've never seen flooded before. And I was shooting as the sun dropped and then right through into the dusk, and it just took on this really inky, incredible blue. And it was such a surprise. You know, I've shot on film like that and on transparency, but never on digital, to the point where you get that real skewing of the blues in the really late twilight. And it was raining as well. I think that probably helped the kind of flatness of the light.
Yeah.
So it's lovely when something happens and I learn something further about the photographic process and have a new experience and add to my kind of repertoire of options. That's always really exciting. Going back to shooting in Puddleton Forest and trying to find different ways of working. Some of the images, rather than just having the light kind of on the surface of the water, I overlaid over the entire image in a kind of textural mirroring of homemade and Japanese paper, in the way that it's sort of textural and knobbly and obscuring, and at the same time it kind of forces you to just be able to see through at the woodland behind, but it's quite obscured. And I really enjoyed playing with that kind of layering. It's quite a painterly process in a way. You know, it's very different from building something in a woodland setting. You know, it's quite freeing in a sense.
Some of them, where the sparkles from the surface of the water, they almost look like stars. So they took me back to your stars series, actually.
Yeah, there is a kind of echoing there, isn't there? Yeah, I enjoyed that. I mean, I love making the stars series, and normally I make all my work in the woods, but it's fun to sometimes, you know, see what can happen if you take that digital process a bit further. And you know, I kind of shoot the raw materials and then see what happens.
And a bit more experimental in that stage, at that stage of the process with this work, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And because I'm always trying to realise a kind of mental image, it's a kind of a creative challenge to find a way to translate something from something I've thought of in my mind into a reality. But along the way, things always happen, and there's always a kind of metamorphosis, I suppose, of the idea that takes on, like I was saying before, takes on its own kind of journey.
Yeah.
Any kind of any way to expand on that is always really interesting.
Going back to the flashes of brightness and lights, which I certainly saw, I did see elements of darkness, and there's almost a sense of foreboding in some of the works. And I wondered if that was somehow a reflection of your mood and your feelings about the future with the climate crisis in mind.
I think that's such a central part to this situation that we're in at the moment. We've got so many problems to solve, but we have to go forward with energy and hope, and make sure that we can make changes that are going to, you know, sort out a lot of these problems, because I think a lot of us feel quite helpless, and I think our governments really need to take a strong position. And I hope that after everything that happens with where we are now with coronavirus, that we can look at ways of rebuilding in a greener way. Maybe this is an opportunity. Obviously this is not something that I was thinking about when I made this work, because none of us did.
No, of course, no. Do you imagine that people might view the works differently somehow now than they might have done 2 months ago before the lockdown started? People are engaging with nature more. There are fewer cars clogging up the roads. There are no aeroplanes in the sky. That perhaps they might be even more pertinent now, and that they just might spark something in the imagination of people that they may not have 2 months ago.
I hope that we all come out of this changed for the better. Whether the work will do that, I can't say, but it's really exciting to be getting it out into the world, because I didn't know how that was going to happen. when we went into coronavirus, it was such a shocking and dramatic and fast process for all of us. It made some things seem, I guess it stripped everything away and made me feel that maybe even my art was just a bit frivolous. You know, so there's so much pleasure involved and there's so much horror going on, and the two things just felt really uncomfortable. But as time's gone by, I'm starting to see that there is a value in creativity and art, and that people need more than the news. You know, they need to nourish their souls with reading and culture. I hope that there's a place out there for my new work, and I'm really looking forward to getting it out.
Thank you so much for speaking to me. It's so great to hear your thoughts on the work. And
thank you. It's really good to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.